Okay, thank you so much for joining us on diversity and inclusion. We had an amazing show for you all today. We're very happy to welcome Pamela Yuen to the show. Pamela was born to Hong Kong migrants in rural Ontario. She's an expressive writing facilitator with the Toronto Writers Collective and serves on the executive committee of the Canadian Authors Association here in Toronto. Recordings of her spoken word poetry can be heard through Brickyard, an audiovisual hub of Brick Books. Pamela, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, so you work with the Canadian Authors Association. So just tell us a little bit about your background as well as your work with this organization.
Yeah, for sure. I discovered the group probably a couple of years ago, and they were just starting to reboot. And what happened was, I'm a poet, and I was looking for a writing group to sort of get involved with and get some feedback with some works in progress. And one of my friends, Jason Timmermanis, he's a short fiction writer, actually found a writing circle that was hosted by this group called the Canadian Authors Association, which I had heard nothing about them. But that's how I got in. It was just purely out of self-interest because I needed a group of writers to actually work with. But as I got to know people in the group and got to know people on the executive, you realize like what a fantastic resource this organization actually is. So it's a national organization and it's split into regional chapters. And their whole motto is writers helping writers. And it really is about that. So they've got lots of great programming, both on the craft side, like what I was getting involved with initially, like the writers groups. And they also have really good, business talks, like how to work with an editor, how to work with a publisher. And it's a great networking experience overall. So if you're really looking to polish your business acumen or your craft, something like this really gives you a really good supportive group. So when you join an organization like this, you get access to other writers at all stages of their careers. And it's a very supportive group. So, we go to each other's launches, we go to each other's book talks. It's incredibly supportive. So, I mean, especially in times like this, where we're all kind of siphoned off in our own little corners, it's been really invaluable in terms of just keeping connected to the community. And it's something that certainly helps me develop better as a writer.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're absolutely right with regards to building a community because as writers, as creators, we tend to really focus in on our craft and sometimes we can get tunnel vision. So it's also very good too to have a supportive network that you can kind of fall back on. Now, with respect to your own creative journey, I'm just wondering how it has informed your approach to writing.
You mean in terms of the organization and being involved in that?
Yeah, both the organization and just yourself as an individual creative.
Yeah, it's weird because, like you said, we're so in our heads as creatives all the time, right? And especially, I don't know, like I'm a huge introvert, so my natural tendency is to just write in my own little corner and stay in my own little corner, and you develop kind of a weird echo chamber in your own head after a while, and you start to lose touch with what actually is the truth in your writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's been, in terms of my own development as a writer, I mean, I was writing for as long as I can remember as a kid, but I didn't actually start putting a little bit more professional effort into it until probably my mid-20s. So I was sort of very late to the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there are so many practical reasons why that happened. I think especially as, people coming from racialized backgrounds, it's not really something that's encouraged to get to be a creative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I had like these typical Asian parents who were very much like, focus on your studies, focus on making a living.
Yeah.
And the more you suppress that desire to create and to make art and to actually express yourself, the worse it kind of gets, and there's more turmoil that builds up.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess at a certain point, I became more, I came to that realization that I had to actually write and make my art. And once you hit that point, and after you're in your sort of bedroom for years and years typing away, there does come a point where you have to actually share and actually, and that's the only way you can flourish and grow is by reaching out to other people and connecting with other people and really getting over that fear of putting yourself out there.
Mm-hmm. I think that.
And again,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, go ahead. and like that supportive community, like just to have those cheerleaders behind you has been fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you're saying that because I agree with you in the sense that you are in your room writing out different things, and then it's interesting. I wonder if you had a similar experience to myself where when you first decided to share it, whether there was some sense of trepidation in terms of what the response would actually be, because, up until that point, you've never offered your work and you never received any type of creative, constructive criticism. So, from your
Mhm.
point, if you can think back to your first time actually sharing your work, what was that feedback like? And was it what you were expecting? And how was that process, and how did it all turn out?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's so terrifying to actually put your work out there. But I
Yeah.
think I've been lucky. I've been in some really great workshops. Years ago, I think I started doing workshops with U of T's continuing studies program. And it's really great to have those structures in place if you're new to sharing your work. So
Hmm.
having a workshop environment that is has ground rules and is again like full of very supportive people.
Yeah.
I've been in groups that are just they're borderline nasty. Like
Yeah.
some people thrive off that, right? But certainly for I think for most creatives, like we're a little bit sensitive. So I mean, that's not how I think a lot of people actually work.
Yeah.
But generally, like it's been so positive. Certainly with the Canadian Authors Association, with our writing group, it's
Hmm.
incredibly helpful. There's always so much positive feedback, and anything that's critical is given with such a good heart. And it's always focused on the work itself, which is
Hmm.
amazing. So finding that niche where you can actually share safely and where you can actually have a safe space is going to help you grow as an artist by leaps and bounds. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point where you do have to be accustomed to receiving that creative, constructive criticism as well. Because if you think of any artist or any creative or any professional for that matter, to get better, you do need a critical eye on whatever you're doing. And I have experienced that as well, where you go into certain writers groups and it's like they're taking out all of their aggression. They're sort of like they pent it
Mhm.
up and they save it up until that meeting, right? And then they just unleash it on different people.
Oh my gosh.
They
Yes,
just puddle
it's
people into the
true.
ground. It's really, in a sense, it's very it could be traumatizing, right? And it's an assault if you really think about it with some people's approach to giving constructive criticism. So with that said, I'm just wondering, we all have these different things that we do in terms of creating our work, right? So I'm just wondering for you, are there any rituals that you have that you go through in order to kind of get those creative juices flowing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's going to be different for everyone. And again, like, having that structure in place is so critical because otherwise it's easy just to keep putting it off. And during the pandemic, especially, I've had so many dry spells where it's like I
Yeah.
just can't produce anything because, you've been just sort of crippled with anxiety or you're just sucked into Netflix for days on end, right?
Exactly, that rabbit hole, yeah.
I know it's awful. So I mean, and I'm just starting to find that kind of groove again.
Mhm.
And for me, it depends on what you're producing too. Like I'm a poet, so a
Yeah.
lot of the work that I do is introspective. It has to do with sort of digging out your own bone marrow, so to speak.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times, if I keep a daily journal. Actually, I keep two versions. I have like a line a day, which is like, okay, if I die, I can share this with my grandchildren, and everything's going to be cool and kosher.
I like that.
It's fine.
Two versions,
And
yeah.
then I have two versions. I literally have two versions. I have a line of day journal, and then I have it's like this erasable notebook. It's called
Oh,
Rocket Book. It's really cool.
interesting.
So it's
Huh.
kind of like it's like a dry erase board, literally.
Yeah.
So you have and it feels kind of like paper. So you're writing, and then you can get all your thoughts down. You can unpack everything, and then take a screenshot with your phone, and then it uploads to an app. So you can have all of like your inner workings in there,
Hmm.
and then you can spray it down and just wipe it clean. So it's a
Wow.
clean slate. So every day you start off with a blank slate, and it's all been uploaded to the cloud, like what you did the day
Wow.
before.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah, so that's been very helpful for me, just to making sure that it keeps me honest. Um, a lot of times, I do a lot of narrative poetry, for example. So I'm telling stories.
Hmm.
And even if it's fiction, it's the best work comes from a sense of truth. So I
Definitely.
find that and it's tricky when you're writing, because sometimes you always want to make sure that it's coming from a place of authenticity. So being able to actually look at your shadow self and being able to actually get your thoughts on paper and your challenges and your reflections on the world has been really invaluable. So
Mm-hmm.
some of my most productive work has come from those journals. I'm a computer writer, which is the antithesis of what I think a lot of poets do, but I can only write poetry on like the computer, like second draft wise, but
Oh,
some of
wow.
my like the notes almost always come out of my free journaling.
That's so interesting, though, that there's sort of that dichotomy. And you mentioned something very interesting as well, is, that your shadow self is helping you create as well. So do you think in terms of creativity, whether, you're painting, you're taking pictures,
Mhm.
you're an architect, do you think that you do need that shadow self in order to create work that's authentic and comes from a place of humility?
Um, yeah. I mean, I think we all have our yeah, like our shadow selves, right? And it's all going to come from different gradients of gray. And
Hmm.
I always kind of say, if you want to be a writer and you're not, into self-flagellation, like it's going to be a little bit tricky for you, right? You're going to have a really hard time with it.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm not saying that, pain and suffering is the driver, and I would gladly exchange that just to be a happy person.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
if you can sort of tap into that, like that certainly helps me. And it's a kind of therapy for me,
Hmm.
like it's a way of confronting that self and turning it into something that is creative. Yeah, and again, whether you're painting, whether you're doing photography, whether you're doing any kind of creative work, um, there's almost like a toxic positivity that we live in these days, right? Like it's
Hmm.
almost like you
Interesting.
have to be like positive and happy with everything, and with the drive of positive psychology and it's all very helpful.
Hmm.
But I think for myself as an artist, if without confronting the parts of me that I have trouble reconciling with my conscious self, it's very
Hmm.
difficult to actually create any kind of art that's meaningful.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think that's actually what causes catharsis, is that when you're able to do that and come from a very authentic place, people recognize it. And the interesting thing is they may not initially recognize what it is, but there's something about your work that speaks to them. Maybe they can't even articulate it at that particular point, but I think people in general can tell. And Tony Kushner is one of my favorite playwrights, has said this, that the point of the theater is actually to create a space of therapy in some sense, where people can see themselves being portrayed, not necessarily, you know, you
Mhm.
know, events happening in exactly the same fashion, whatever, but just in the sense of the connective, empathetic action that they can actually recognize and see that people are going through these trials and tribulations, and that there's a way in which to deal with them. So I think it is very
Yeah.
important to have sort of that authentic voice, and you cannot necessarily have that without going to those dark spaces at times.
Yeah, it's a great point about what you said about recognizing that in others, and maybe not right away, but that is the beauty about art, right? Like it makes us more empathetic as people, because you are actually putting yourself in someone else's shoes whenever you're watching a play, or whenever you're watching a condition.
Exactly. I agree. So with regards to, poetry in your journey, how did you actually discover the spoken word? At what age were you, and what way did it speak to you?
Oh, when did I discover poetry?
Yes.
Oh, so I came to it really late. Like it was, I was a bit of a prose writer before, but I was probably in my mid-20s before I
Oh,
started
okay. Yeah.
actually exploring, poetry and spoken word. And again, like I think that was just a number of things, just finding other distractions. Um, and just and deep inside I think we all know where we're kind of messing up in our lives, right? Like if we're
Yeah.
really honest with ourselves. So I think up until that point, like I'd been purposely seeking out other expressions that were a bit safer, that didn't sort of confront like what I needed to actually confront. And then with poetry, it was just I took a creative writing class just to sort of dip my toes into again, and nothing really resonated as much as poetry did. I think the obliqueness made it safe at first, just coming at a story in a way that wasn't head on. And then I just started getting more and more wrapped up into it, and I started discovering all of these great writers I'd sort of forgotten about, and then and the joy of discovering new poetry and the way of, the expression taking the top of your head off, right? Like that's never going to end.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I definitely came to it, I think, much later in life, and I have so much admiration for people who just know right away, like, high school poets, high school slam artists. Like, I can't, like, I'm just like, how did you do that? Like, I was like, that's amazing to have that much self-awareness and to have that much passion about your art so early. I have so much respect for it.
Yeah, I know it's interesting because you did say that earlier that you sort of came to it in your 20s. I thought that that's when you actually started to read it, but maybe I thought you started to write it a little bit earlier. But it's, you said slam poetry, which is interesting because one of my favorite slam poets is Saul Williams. And so, yeah, so when I saw him perform, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about it just sort of sparking something. So actually, after that performance, I went home and I wrote my first poem, and so that was sort of my intro to it. But it's interesting these different things that you actually experience. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your journey, has there been a performance or something that you've seen that actually has inspired you to write and to create different works?
Oh wow, yeah. There's so many great artists out
Yeah.
there. Gosh, right now, Rudy Francisco is one of my favorite spoken word artists, and like every time I see anything on YouTube, it's just it blows my mind how he can speak so honestly and so simply about things. And I think a lot of
Hmm.
spoken word artists are like this, where you can just say something and it's like it's just there and it's so simple, but it's also so sophisticated and eloquent, and it just really hits the nail on the head.
Hmm.
And like there's nothing like reading and writing, reading good poetry and listening to good poetry that makes you want to go and actually do it yourself. Um,
Yeah.
it's in everything from listening to a song, even
Hmm.
like good art inspires better art. And it's so cool that you had that experience where you actually heard a performance and then decided to actually go and write your first poem.
Yeah, it was interesting. Also,
Was it modeled on something you heard, or was it just sort of a leaping off point?
it was more of a leaping off point, but for me, it was just a challenge to see if I could actually do it. And my intent though was, if I could just
Mhm.
write something with sort of like a modicum of power that he did, then that would be a success, right? I don't want to be Saul Williams because he's on the mountaintop, right? He's on Mount Olympus or wherever, where Calliope and all the other poets go to be worshipped. So I just want to, if I could just put my foot on that mountain, then I would consider that a success. And so that was my focus, and then it sort of developed from that point. But I'm wondering, 'cause another thing too, as artists and creators, we have to also be self-reflective and go through our work. So I'm just wondering, as far as you're concerned and your experience, like how hard are you on yourself when it comes to your work? Are you pretty lenient, or are you very strict about the type of work you produce?
Yeah, I think we're all our own worst critics, right? Like I
Hmm.
think there's always that sense, and it's always like it's like a cycle. Like you get excited about something, and you're like, this is great, this is great. Oh, and this is no, this is terrible.
Exactly.
Oh, this is okay again. This is
I'm a
okay again.
genius.
Exactly. Or like you read something else and you're like, oh, I thought I was doing okay, and all of a sudden it just totally pales in comparison.
Yeah,
And then like at the end of the day, you're like, okay, maybe this isn't so bad. Like I can do okay, and it's a very humbling experience, I think,
it
to
is.
put any kind of work out there. But absolutely, I'm my own worst critic, and for a long time, I was really scared of submitting anything, to any kind of journals, because it was
Yeah,
always, this isn't good enough, this isn't good enough.
yeah.
Um, and then sometimes you read work, and you're like, this is okay, but if they can do it, like I can do it too, right?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, so true.
come on.
Yeah,
um, like some people are just like they have talent, and there's always going to be that raw talent, but like
mhm.
what really sets them apart is just their complete fearlessness to actually go out and to perform
Mm-hmm.
and to put their work out there and to actually promote themselves, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that inner critic is really it's a challenge because it also is a real hindrance to self promotion. Um, and it's not always comfortable, obviously, being in the spotlight and being able to actually um, be open to that kind of criticism. But certainly, like, you're always going to have the mean YouTube comments. You're always going to have like the nasty people out there. You basically, if you're producing work, you're going to have your critics, right? And that's just the way it goes. But yeah, it's a lifelong challenge. Like, how do you quiet that inner critic that you have enough, while at the same time listening to what you need to actually do to make your work better
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
actually push it forward.
Yeah, that's a very interesting dilemma that you've put in. And it's funny because I heard Philip Seymour Hoffman talk about that as well, about how he was always struggling with a character, always struggling with if he was good enough, and always struggling with approaching the work. And Daniel Day-Lewis is the same thing. So I think, yeah, when you're an artist, and also think too, as an artist, you kind of know the type of
Mm-hmm.
work that you can actually produce, right? And it's sort of an exercise in bridging the divide between what you can accomplish versus the vision
Mm-hmm.
for your work, and trying to coalesce those as closely as possible is sort of what the challenge is. And with that
Absolutely.
said, I'm wondering, because also, mentorship and things like that are extremely important, as you mentioned earlier. With the organization, Canadian Authors Association, there's that sense of mentorship and community. So, in terms of your development as a creative and as a writer, how important has that been to you? And were there any, or are there any specific mentors that are continuing to make a huge contribution in terms of your work?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I mean, like, like we said before, there's only so much you can do on your own, right?
Yeah.
And at a certain point, you have to make that gap. And like speaking to what I was going at before, like I was sort of dabbling in writing here and there, but I didn't start reaching out to people and really writing and reading until, yeah, my mid 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for me, like when I was at U of T, Catherine Graham is a local Toronto poet, and she was one of my teachers, and she's been a fantastic writer, really, really supportive for the writing community.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, in the writing circle that I'm in, there's a couple of poets that are in the group as well. Um, Lee Parpart is the president, co-president of Canadian Authors Association, and she's been wonderful in her leadership of the group as a whole, and in all of the programming, and in all, the business part and in the craft part. Like, that is absolutely essential to have that kind of leadership at the helm. And you can't like speak enough to the people who actually light the way for you and actually take the time to give you that kind of feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's through like a paid workshop and something that helps people actually make a living, whether it's through a volunteer workshop of your peers. Either way, like, as long as you have that kind of relationship, it's a good to actually keep it challenges you. You want someone to actually who can push you further than where you've been right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very,
I
very
don't know.
key.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've had mentors like that yourself. I feel like every kind of creative has had that experience where you have to have people who lift you up.
Yeah, definitely. And especially being that, being a creative is an extremely isolating type of experience. So you do need either a voice of
Mhm.
reason or voice of encouragement to kind of get you through those moments where you think, am I crazy? Like, to me pursuing this thing. And, and especially if you're trying to do something that you've never done before. And what I really love too, and
Mhm.
maybe this applies to yourself, is I
Mhm.
love to do things that I don't think I can do. If I'm 100% confident that I can actually do it and in the exact way that I want to do it, then it bores
Mhm.
me. But if I'm
Mhm.
75, 80%, I could probably do it, then I'm really intrigued and I want to get it done, right? Is
It's
that
like
the
Oh, absolutely. It's like you need to have that. It's like that spot. It's interesting how you put it like that. The 75%. That's like the magic kind of ratio where
yeah.
it's like, um, I've heard it called, like, I've heard other people describe it, right? It's like your sphere of influence. So you have what you're very comfortable doing,
Yeah.
and then like what you're like, I'm never gonna, write a screenplay or whatever, and then you have this middle ground where you're like, I guess maybe I could write a draft. And then like that is where the magic happens, that little
Yes.
in-between space of the possible, the impossible, what you think is impossible. And then there's that ground where you kind of bridge the extra 25%, I guess, to fill in that
Exactly.
little pie chart.
And that 25% is so beautiful when you actually
Oh
get it
yeah,
done. Oh man, there's nothing better than that. That's the
it's
promised
so
land.
true.
That's
It
so
really is. And it's just like but it's so uncomfortable, right? Like
yeah.
it's like um you just really need to have someone like either push you over the edge or just be willing to make that jump.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but it really is like, like getting into that territory where you haven't done it before. And a lot, in creatives, right, it's easy again to also just fall into that where you're doing the same thing over and over again. You're writing the same like poem, you're writing the same play over and
Mhm.
over again. You're doing the same characters because that's your comfort spot, right? We
Yeah.
all have our go-to, whether it's throwing a bird in a poem for the sake of doing that, or like just like we all have our lines that we like to go to, and it's you almost need an editor to save you from yourself, and you need someone who can and push you into new territory.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
I agree. And it's interesting too because the feedback that you get also sort of affects what you produce. So if, for example, you write a piece or a poem or screenplay or something like that that gets
Mhm.
a lot of praise, then I think subconsciously you want to recreate that. So instead of going in
Mhm.
another direction, you say, no, no, but they like this better. So let me do some more of this and
Mhm.
get that
Mhm.
adulation again. So I think
Oh,
one of the difficult things is trying to separate yourself from that. And how have you found that in your journey in terms of, separating yourself from the bravo,
oh
bravo.
God, yeah, it's hard because like you're like keeping like yeah, it's tricky because sometimes like the worst work I've produced, you know, worst I'll quote is like when you have an audience in mind, right? Like you're writing for this invisible audience that is going to hear your work or they're going to be reading your poems, and that is the absolute worst way to write because
Exactly. It is. It is. It's bad.
it's like
So
it's
bad.
like, oh my God, I might as well, like, I mean, I have a day job, right? And like, that's like, it's cool. Like, someone like gives me a paycheck to do a certain thing. Like, that's like absolutely a fair exchange.
Yeah.
And it's just, it sucks when you're trying to make art and you're also beholden to like, the expectations of your audience. So, as a consumer of art, like I love consistency. Like, oh, I love
Mhm.
that one style, right? Like, and I want that same album produced like 12 times.
Exactly. Me too. Yeah. That same song. Just sing that one song.
I just kept transposing it to the whole like 12 albums. That's all I want. I want the same thing. And like it's the age old like dilemma. So as an artist, you want to grow, like you want
Yeah.
to change. So it's tricky. It's really hard when you're keeping like whether it's a commercial production factor in mind, or if you're just writing for the applause, right? Like what is popular right now,
Mhm.
and like but like honestly, like if you are into something and you are into a certain style, or you're into an aesthetic, or you're into a certain subject matter, there's going to be someone else out there who likes what you like,
Oh, definitely.
and who is into what you're into, right? So I mean, it's about again like just keeping that authenticity to your work, but like that nothing will kill your work faster than I think writing for an imagined audience. It's so intimidating too, right?
Yeah.
Like,
And
I don't know.
and the weird thing is that you could never really please them, right? Because they're just a figment, I think,
Mhm.
of your imaginations. And people's change shifts as well. And I think that if art is coming from an authentic place, even if it's something that no one has ever seen before, because I'm reminded about, sort of the impressionists, right? And how they were considered to be
Mhm.
non-artists because they didn't conform to what was accepted. They couldn't even get it,
Mhm.
they didn't
Mhm.
couldn't even get the work shown, and now all of a sudden they're
Isn't that
geniuses,
crazy?
right? It's like, what's
Things
going?
change.
Yeah,
Things change. It's nuts, right? Like, and that's like
it is.
I think that's the beauty of the internet age too, right? Like now everything is so accessible, and you don't need to necessarily have like your own gallery, for example, to show
Yeah.
your weird art anymore. Like now you just need an Instagram account. Um,
Yes.
it's blown up the range of what we call like taste, right? Like it's
Mm,
just, and it's incredible.
hmm.
I'm always amazed by like the rabbit hole of internet that you can get into just looking at what's out there and what's available and the types of artists that are producing work, whether it's visual, whether it's music, whether it's poetry or fiction. There's always like all the huge range, and like there's a hashtag for every single little like
That's so true.
like teensy tiny like thing out there. Like
Yeah.
it's really neat, and so it's really become a democracy in the truest sense, right? Like there is no um true like that. I think like that gatekeeping aspect
Yes.
of art has really blown away in the last few years. I mean, it's not to say that there's no more prestige or certain more forms that are considered more legitimate, but it's
Mm.
just like it's totally different these days. And I think what was once laughed at is now like you said, is becoming much more mainstream. Like the Impressionists are a great example.
Yeah.
Things like graphic novels, in the past few years have also sort of become a legitimate form
Hmm.
of its own. Like it's nuts. So if you told me 20 years ago that you're gonna have a comic book writer who's going to be producing what's considered real art, you can get like your MFA now in comics. Like it's incredible, right? So like this imaginary audience we have that is a little bit ridiculous. You're totally right, because there's no longer a single audience. It really is this like fractal little pockets here and there of people who are into whatever they're into. And like, yeah, thank God for the internet for the last decade or so. It's just been amazing.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. And I think that it also then the flip side of it now is that you don't have an excuse not to create, right? Whereas before it was like, oh, these people won't read my work. I submitted
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Oh
No, but
yeah.
now that excuse is completely thrown out the window because, as you said, there's a hashtag for everything. You can produce your own work. You can self-publish. You can create your own
Oh
fans,
yeah,
Instagram, and
absolutely.
yeah. So it's
Absolutely. Self-publishing has been such a boon for writers, especially, right?
yes.
Like now it's like you can write your own little like whatever you want to do, and put it out there and be a published author. And
Mm,
some people think that it's like you could argue that produces a lot of like crap work, but also it just really creates this democracy of what is acceptable and
mhm.
what is legitimate and what is worthy of being consumed by the public.
Hmm. And I think to your point, that the market will always dictate what's quality. So whether it's produced by an
Mhm,
artist or an author that happens to be with a major publisher, or if they publish it
mhm,
themselves, I tend to think that the great art actually rises to the top. So if you're
mhm,
producing good work, authentic work, work that expresses your own personal opinion or viewpoint, but it comes from a very pure place, then
mhm.
I think you'll be successful. You'll find at least some people within your audience. But if you're trying to ascribe to something that you may not even believe, but you're just riding that trend, and so for myself, like I would never be able to write like a vampire novel or anything like that, right? Because and no
Why
no,
not?
no
Love to
hate.
read
It's
it.
not like no hate or anything like that. But it's just that that's not where my focus is, right? And so if
Oh
I
yeah,
was to
yeah.
kind of ride that wave, Anne Rice and everything like that, I mean, that I would produce a very bad book, because my heart and my focus would not be in producing that book. So I know
Absolutely.
so and with that said, we're talking about a lot of different opportunities, different venues, and things like that, and a lot of things that have come up to the fore right now, which is fantastic. Other than the different avenues in which to produce your work, is this idea, of diversity and inclusion, and how that needs
Hmm.
to permeate different sectors of our society. So, with regards to yourself, what are your thoughts with regards to this? I don't want to say emergence because there have been people
Hmm.
fighting and
Yeah.
struggling to get to this particular point. But how do you think this is gonna develop? In the next 5, 10, 15 years, not only on the creative side, but also the people that'll be in the executive offices and things like that, making decisions as to who gets this particular deal and who gets this particular opportunity.
Oh wow, yeah, absolutely. It's yeah. Like as publishing is not the most diverse field, right? Like
Yeah.
it's traditionally and writing as well. Like it's traditionally it's a white domain. You know, it can be very male oriented. Um, I mean, it's crazy how much things have changed in the
Hmm.
last, you know, even 10 years, and even in the last year. I mean, after the horror show of last summer, you know, like it was a bit of a watershed moment, and it's crazy how,
Hmm.
you know, I mean, we've always been here, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what always gets me. Like, you know, BIPOC writers, you know, disabled writers, queer writers, we've always been here. We've always produced, and
Hmm.
like we're finally getting a little bit of recognition, and it's on one hand it's like, yes, I, you know, there's finally that validation,
Hmm.
and then like there's the cynical part of me that is like, you know, I don't want to just be a token. I don't think, you know, we should use people as you know, to make ourselves feel better about our professional lives either, right?
Hmm.
So there's
Yeah.
always going to be that balance, and I'm sure you've experienced it where, you know, you're being asked to do a lot of labor, right? Like a lot of emotional labor, a lot of physical labor, a lot of you know, intellectual labor, and
Hmm.
sometimes it's not going to be compensated, and sometimes it's, you know, you can feel like as a racialized person that, you know, I'm being asked to do this because you know, they need to fill a spot. And
Hmm.
like I know with Canadian Authors Association, it's we've been very cognizant of that fact.
Hmm.
um, and I and people can tell when you're just, when it's just words, when it's just
Hmm.
something, that a statement that's coming out, right? And there's, I'm not going to name names, but, you know, we've seen it on the internet where, you know, organizations make lofty speeches but don't actually have any kind of action
Yeah.
behind it.
Hmm.
So, you know, we have the, you know, we have a diversity committee on CAA. So we want to
Hmm.
make sure that not only that our executive board reflects the realities of Toronto, but also, you know, that we can serve the people of Toronto, and like we can actually help other writers achieve their goals who are, you know, not of the traditional, like, I guess, well, the hegemonic discourse of what makes a writer and what makes a publisher, and who gets to control who is valid and who's legitimate.
Hmm.
And it's changing, and it's and we're all learning, and, you know, if we're doing it right, we're always going to be making mistakes. There's no, you know, there's no perfect way to make diversity and inclusion work, but it's like, what a wild ride though, the last year or so, right? So, and
Hmm.
we're constantly working, and it's an everyday thing to make sure that inclusion happens, and it happens on a level that is transformative and permanent, and can
Hmm.
actually take us forward instead of being like a flavor of the month kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
important what you said in terms of the commitment that is actually there, because I think we all agree that things do need to change. But I think
Yeah.
it's another thing when you actually are able to put some processes behind it, and actually actualize that particular change,
Mhm.
because otherwise we'll just be, continuously talking about it. And I think it's incumbent upon everybody to include
Mhm.
themselves in that conversation as well, in order to make sure that things are moving the way that they need to move. And I'm actually very optimistic about what will happen in the future, just given the fact that we've come from such a far place where it's
Oh,
interesting because
yeah.
I was reading this one article, where this one particular author was talking about she actually had to convince people at her publishing house that African Americans did read books. So it's like, yeah.
What?
So we've gone from that conversation. Now we're in a place where we're starting to put different
Mhm.
policies and things in place. But when you sort of think about that trajectory and that journey, it's
Mhm.
baffling, right? It's almost ludicrous that that would actually be a point of contention, that
Mhm.
that was a thing that actually had to be debated. So I think in the next 10, 15 years, things are going to even get more progressive, because as younger people
Mhm.
come up as well and they assume these positions of leadership, their mentality and their approach to creating communities are going to be completely different. They're going to be built on what's happening at this particular point in time. And I'm just really looking forward to to that development and kind of
Oh
adding my
yeah.
own 2 cents into that. So with that said, I'm just wondering, let's say for example, you are the Prime Minister of Canada, right? So
Oh God.
right?
Lord help
So
us.
I know.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm wondering though, um, what would be your set of allocations for the artistic sector? So how much money would you divest to them, and what would you actually like for them to produce?
Oh my gosh, well, that's a dangerous thought.
I know, right? Question.
But I mean, arts is chronically underfunded, as we all
Yeah.
know. Like it's always been, But we've got the Canada Arts Council. We've got all these great organizations that are doing fantastic work, right?
Hmm.
Um, and continuing that support. And I mean, like that's the thing about being prime minister. Like you have the word power to actually have people to listen to you. And yes, arts are important. Performing arts are important. Visual arts, like we need the spoken word, the written word. To hear that coming from the prime minister is so validating. But
Hmm.
also, if you're in a genuine position of leadership and power like that, you actually hold the pen to put the livelihoods of thousands of Canadians
Hmm.
um, at a level that they haven't actually seen before.
Yeah.
It is one of the goals of CEA as well, is just to make sure that writers get fair and equitable treatment
Hmm.
within the workforce. Writing is certainly a legitimate profession, as is any other art form. And just because it's your passion doesn't mean that you don't deserve necessarily to get paid for it. Like it's crazy,
Very true.
right?
Yeah.
What we would ask of people. So I guess what I would do is just making sure that people, those grants continue to be available, the funding completely, continues to be available, and for a lot of minorities, especially, who you might not come from a very privileged background, you may not ever have the option of making that your daytime job if you want to be an artist, just because of the way that capitalism works right now, right? It doesn't necessarily pay.
Hmm.
So, and it does keep a lot of people out of the field and out of the sector. So making sure that people who are at a disadvantage have those access to that kind of funding is absolutely critical for a good ecosystem
Hmm.
to be in place. And setting aside that money for writers of color and creatives of color, and people who are, again, like people who would be blocked out normally of some of the mainstream avenues of funding, just because of lack of access or lack of knowledge of them.
Yeah, that's a very key
Um,
point. Yeah.
yeah, just making sure that awareness is in like the minds of everyone. Um, but yeah, I don't think we can stress enough the importance of the actual difference that hard dollars can make, within an industry and within the lives of creatives who are actually trying to produce their work.
Yeah. Perfect.
And certainly, in publishing, especially, it's such an underfunded area.
It
That would
is.
be it's tough, right? Like it's a tough ecosystem out there.
It's very, very tough. So, as my last question, I want to
Mhm.
ask you, what type of impact would you like to have as an artist and as an individual?
Oh gosh. Y- I mean, like if the work is remembered by people, and if it actually affects them in some small way, or it's memorable in some small way, if it actually resonates with people and people can relate to it, or it makes them think about a certain way, and certain, if they can have a different perspective on things, because that's the whole point of art. Again, is it's like, you're mentioning like theater, like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Like if people can have that experience even for a moment, I would be so honored and thrilled, just to have anyone read my work or listen to my work and be like, oh, that's really cool, I can relate to that, I didn't think about it like that. Like that is what the impact that I would love to have on people, and it's really like all I can ask as an artist, I think.
Awesome. Well, Pamela, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciated it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure.
Our pleasure.